My other ruling concern has been political engagement. And the first thing I'd say in introducing my experience of involvement in public life has to do with the two countries in which I have lived my life: Brazil and the United States. They are remarkably similar. No country in the world more resembles the United States than Brazil. Begin with the obvious elementary facts. Two countries of almost identical size, founded on the same basis of European settlement and African slavery. Both of them very religious societies, and both of them extremely unequal, the most unequal of their respective types. The United States, by far the most unequal of the rich industrial democracies, and Brazil, the most unequal of the continental developing countries. And yet, paradoxically, in these two immensely unjust societies, the majority of ordinary men and women continue to believe that everything is possible. These two countries have the secret of the supreme good, vitality. Vitality and the religion of the future, the doctrine of indefinite possibility. So I regard it as an immense good fortune in my life that my association has been with these two societies, that of all societies in the world are the ones that most immediately approach this ideal of vitality. When I was growing up as a child and in school in the United States, I would spend my summers with my grandfather in Brazil. I come on my mother's side from a family of politicians. My grandfather, Octavio, was the 8th child of a poor pharmacist. His mother had died in his infancy. They came from a poor family, but they all became remarkable. My grandfather began his life as an astronomer. Very young, he was the titular professor of astronomy in the university in Bahia. In 1910, Comet Halley visited the Earth, and in Bahia, as in much of the world, the population viewed it as a presage of the end of the world. The governor of the state invited my grandfather, who was then in his early 20s still, to speak to the people in the largest public square of Bahia about the real meaning of Halley's comet. And this speech of his was so spectacularly successful that the next day the governor visited my grandfather and invited him to run for the Chamber of Deputies, our House of Representatives. And so it was that my grandfather came to spend the rest of his life in politics, in what must be a unique case of having entered politics by virtue of being an astronomer. And he then had a meteoric career in Brazilian politics. He was very young, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But then the government was overthrown in 1930. And my grandfather opposed the person who took power. Getúlio Vargas, and began a series of experiences of imprisonment and of exile, ending, as I said before, in the United States, where my mother met my father. My grandfather founded the centrist Liberal Party in Brazil. His older brother, João, founded the Socialist Party. He had no interest in material things. He occupied many of the highest offices of the state, other than the presidency. But when he died, he didn't even have enough money to pay for his own burial. He wanted nothing. He was entirely engaged in public life, and he was adored. In Bahia, he was regarded as an embodiment of the Republic. My parents would send me to spend my summer vacations with him. We would arrive in Bahia in time for the annual parade with which Bahia commemorates its independence on the 2nd of July. And I would march in this parade as a little child with my grandfather. The experience of coming regularly from New York to this wild, exotic, ecstatic, big burst of life that is Brazil was irresistibly seductive to my imagination as a child. And to me, that was then the experience that first aroused my passion for politics. You might say, contaminated at the very beginning by a romantic impulse. And romanticism, I have come to think, is a misdirection in the development of the revolutionary orthodoxy of the West. But there are elements of truth in romanticism. And one of the elements of truth is this: that to set fire to the world, you have to set fire to yourself. This is the truth of romanticism. And this is the truth that in some way I perceived very early through this vicarious experience of introduction to public life in Brazil. For the first years that I was in the United States, it was impossible to return to Brazil. Those were the darkest moments of the military dictatorship. But as soon as there were the first glimmers of another possibility, I began to present myself in Brazil to the opposition, the unified opposition to the military dictatorship, and to work with them. And the first phase of my political engagement was then an attempt to represent a national alternative and to conceive the move back to democracy as the opportunity for the advancement of this alternative. Then, after Brazil returned to a full democratic life, I began to work with the parties and the politicians who I hoped might win power and change the country in the direction that I defended. In particular, I supported two people whom I believed might win the presidency. I committed the classic mistake of the philosophers in politics, which is to try to find someone else to do the work. They would do the work. I would somehow advise them. And then I would be able to return to my philosophical passion. Robert Musil once remarked that the philosophers are despots without armies. And there is in this false shortcut a fatal illusion. One of the things that I have discovered in my experiences of political engagement is that it is easier to change a country than it is to change a person. The other person is the other, with their own direction, their own impulses, their own beliefs. There is no effective and acceptable form of engagement that can be half-hearted or conditional. So this attempt to find someone else, I discovered, belatedly as I discover almost everything, could not work. And I then began to realize that I had to accept a much higher level of vulnerability than I had initially intended. And then I began to try and to find a party, to form a party, to forge a path for myself. I attempted to run for office. I actually ran, almost symbolically, for office, for the Congress, towards the beginning of this experience, some 20 years ago. And was almost elected, although I had no resources and had a tiny campaign. And then I thought that rather than finding someone else to win the presidency, I should seek it myself. And I continued. I continued in opposition. The fundamental attribute of our country, once again, is its vitality. An immense human energy rising from below. And our basic tragedy has been the denial to the mass of ordinary men and women of the economic and educational equipment needed to do something with their lives. The national alternative that I conceived was intended to address this problem, but it had a broader worldwide context. The broader context is this. The last major refoundation of modern societies took place in the mid-20th century. It was the social democratic settlement in Europe, the New Deal in the United States. And since then, there has been no major reconstruction in the world. The premise of the dominant political ideas is the acceptance of this last institutional and ideological settlement and the attempt to humanize it. Its leitmotif is the humanization of the inevitable. I came to think that it is not enough to sugarcoat this established world, that it is necessary to reconstruct it, and to reconstruct it necessary to reimagine it. without subscribing to the revolutionary and romantic illusions of the 19th and 20th centuries. And so this effort at engagement in Brazil was, for me, not something just specific to one country, to my country, but an instance in one country of a universal problem. We cannot provide this equipment to ordinary men and women. We cannot make good on the essential idea of democracy, which is faith in the constructive genius of common humanity, without innovating in the institutional arrangements. Our ideals and interests are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. And therefore, every consequential transformation in society requires a reconstruction of the institutional arrangements. In particular, the institutional arrangements that define today a democracy, a market economy, and a free civil society. I see my arguments and initiatives in Brazil as an example of this worldwide imperative. Now, there is another context in which I should place this activity, this engagement in public life. I belong to the generation of 1968, which, in the whole world, conceived the view that imagination should be in power, that society should be reconstructed on the model of the imagination. This view has been subsequently derided in the name of realism. Now, it's easy to be a realist if you accept everything, just as it's easy to be a visionary if you resist nothing. The task is to accept little and to resist much. I have remained faithful to this idea of my generation throughout the world. And I have tried in my theoretical work, as well as in my political action, to understand it and to develop it in a way that would make it real, and that would rescue it from its apparent condition of being nothing more than a vain dream. For almost my whole public life in Brazil, I have been in opposition, opposing and proposing. And then only very recently, and for the first time in the life of a man who is now old, I had an experience of participation in government. President Lula, whom I had opposed in his first term, invited me to join his government and conceived for me a position that did not exist before, of long-term planning, of strategic affairs, to help define the direction of the government and of the country. I had power over nothing but jurisdiction over everything. And I took my brief to the hilt, proposing a whole series of structural changes and seeking out the country, state by state, class by class, every sector of Brazilian society during these 2 intense years of engagement. It was a fabulous experience that aroused in me the sense that beneath the appearance of constraint, there is in Brazil, as in every real society, a vast range of suppressed transformative opportunity.